A Build Hatch developed production.
Hello, I'm Aaron Kyle and welcome to another episode of Build Hatch. On this week's episode, we feature architect and practice director James Clarence from Space Design Architecture. This week's episode was an interesting one, told through the eyes of an architect who talks about his journey from starting out in the industry, learning to draft by hand, and then transitioning from a large national practice into his own design practice with his fellow directors. In only 8 years, SDA has grown into a company employing almost 20 people. I really enjoyed this week, as it's always great to hear about other people's perspectives, especially the designers of the projects. Now let's get into it. James Clarence, welcome to Build Hatch.
Thanks, Aaron. It's great to be here.
Today we're recording the Build Hatch podcast in SDA's offices in the Junction, which, for anyone listening to this, Space Design Architecture is a local architecture practice. And on today's show, we have James Clarence, who's one of the directors. As always with our guests on Build Hatch, we always like to take it back to the beginning. Now, you're our first architect on our show, which is exciting. So whereabouts did you grow up?
Newcastle born and bred. I was born in Belmont. Did have a small stint in Muswellbrook for 9 odd years. Left Belmont when I was 9 months old and came back at the end of year 3. But then I've been here ever since. So I moved back to Belmont and then got out of Belmont because there's too many Clarences in Belmont. So
Now, when you were at school, did you have any aspirations to become an architect?
yeah, I knew pretty early on I wanted to be an architect. I loved tech drawing at school. Did engineering science. Not sure why. There's no engineering in architecture anymore. So I knew pretty early. I loved drawing. Used to do tech drawing for fun, which is kind of odd, but yeah, worked for me.
Coming out of high school, did you go all the way to year 12?
Yeah, I did. And I went straight to uni from school. Didn't have a break at all. And then got through the first degree, so the first 3 years of architecture.
So did you know right from the beginning that you wanted to get into architecture at uni?
Yes, yep. So I did exactly what I needed to do in the HSC to get the mark I needed for uni. And that was about it. So yeah, it worked out pretty well. I got just enough marks to get into architecture and away I went.
So what inspired you to enter architecture? Like growing up, did you have any sort of involvement in construction or design or anything like that?
No, not really. Didn't have any family really in the industry. Had an uncle who's a carpenter, but wasn't really heading down that path. I'd always been pressured from family to go to uni. But yeah, so I think it was seeing a lot of project homes and seeing how homes weren't customised to the people who lived in them. That really didn't make any sense to me. So my aim in becoming an architect was to really do site-specific projects that work for the people that are going to live in them.
And so I guess going through university, did you have any like practical internships to go along with it, or did you get the opportunity to work for architectural practices outside of uni?
I did 2 weeks of work experience. Well, I did work experience in year 10 with Killen and Doran Architects, who got me to redraw mum and dad's house. So I've still got that. It's hand-drawn before CAD came along, so actually using a drawing board, which was kind of, we're at the crux of changing over to CAD when we kind of started uni. So we did learn to draft by hand in first year, but then pretty quickly after that it all turned to CAD. So yeah, I did work experience for those guys. Then I did a little bit of work experience during the first degree, but then got my first job at Suters Architects in town.
So was that straight out of uni?
Yeah, so straight after the third year. So it's a 3-year degree and then another 2-year degree. So I had my year out in between working for Suters, and then worked for Suters after that part-time during uni, and then for another 10 odd years after that.
I remember when studying construction management, we were in the same fraternity as architectural students. So they were pretty closely aligned. And I distinctly remember that at the time, if you were an architect outside of uni, once you'd finished, the top tier firms, if you like, at that time you had Cox Architects and Suters. I remember they were sort of the two names that came to my mind back then. They were the guys that you could go effectively want to work for, you know? So I guess having that opportunity for you to exit uni and go work for Suters was a pretty good opportunity.
Oh, it was a great opportunity for me.
And it would have been extremely competitive to get that position, I'd imagine.
Yeah, it was largely referral from other people that you'd worked with or been to uni with, that then kind of got you a foot in the door, and then you just had to go from there. So really good opportunity, really loved working there, learned everything I know about architecture from there. University and myself didn't really agree. I was way too pragmatic for architecture at uni. It wasn't nearly artistic enough, and I always wanted to make sure that things worked. I wanted to make sure I had fire stairs and that my buildings were buildable, and that didn't really fly with architecture uni degrees. So yeah, getting out into the real world really helped me build my knowledge of architecture and really kind of cemented the way that I approach architecture still today.
Now, you mentioned earlier about that transition from drafting to CAD. What was that like? That would have been really interesting, I'd imagine.
Yeah, it was. It was during uni, so it was all kind of new to us. The only thing I knew about drafting was from tech drawing at school. So that was a fairly easy transition into our first project at uni was drawing up the barns at Tocal, so Tocal Homestead up near Maitland. Drawing up those barns by hand. We had to go and measure them. We had to draw them up, and they were very irregular buildings. So they were trying to teach us how to document things and how to observe what we see and make sure that we know how to measure things and do things fairly practically. So that was really good. But then pretty well after that, we got into learning ArchiCAD and kind of taking it from there. So there's a lot of Photoshop, a lot of ArchiCAD, a lot of physical model building, which doesn't really get done that much anymore. So yeah, it was all an interesting learning curve.
And it would have been very practical, like you said, having, I guess, going out and almost surveying those internal floor areas of buildings and trying to capture, particularly for renovations and alterations and additions.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do a lot of that now at SDA. We do a whole heap of residential alterations and additions projects. So we're forever going out, measuring up, drawing up existing, combining that with a survey and turning that into our existing model, which is the basis that we kind of start from.
Now, working at Suters, you said you got a lot of practical experience. How long were you at Suters for?
Overall, I was at Suters for about 12 years. So I started out working, doing projects in Sydney, doing apartment buildings down there. So that was a baptism of fire. I remember Ed Clode, my director at the time. I got given the ArchiCAD standards for Suters and asked to kind of go through those, make sure I was familiar with that. I had a week to do that. And after one day, Ed said to me, "Righto, you've learnt that. We need to get this done." So that was it.
Off you go.
So that was my learning in ArchiCAD standards at Suters. And from there, it really developed a lot very quickly because we didn't have much choice. So yeah, so it was good. Spent a lot of time doing apartment buildings early on. Then we spent 5 years doing the Mater Hospital redevelopment in Waratah. So that was a really big project, biggest project in Newcastle at the time. and it was a really good way to get across all aspects of a project. So we started on that after the master plan was done. We basically started and went all the way through to construction on that project. So
on a hospital of that size, like it's a pretty big hospital, how many architects would traditionally be involved in that sort of project?
So we were lucky enough, we partnered with PTW Architects in Sydney. So they were doing the interior design on it, and we were doing the overall architecture, the overall building design. So that was a really good partnership. We at Suters, we had anywhere between kind of 3 and 4 of us on that project, so not a huge team. And then PTW probably had the same at different stages during the project.
Now, for the people listening to this who may not understand this, but it is quite common on, particularly with larger projects, you'll have multiple architects. And in my prior career working for a property developer, we had the same arrangement where one architect did the interiors and another architect did the overall master planning. But I guess for the people listening to this, what's the core reason that a government or a larger client, because it usually only happens on larger projects, but why do they do that?
Largely, I think it comes down to experience. So PTW have done many health projects. Suters at the time had done health projects, but needed that kind of experience to come together, and we then provided the local knowledge. We were there on site. We could work with the builder to make sure it all went pretty smoothly. But yeah, it largely comes down to that health experience, making sure that you're getting the right outcome, that you're meeting all the standards, that all of your a lot of user group kind of meetings have to happen, a lot of reviews have to happen. So just making sure that that process went pretty smoothly. Really important to get someone with good experience to go through that process.
Now, what about the history of SDA, which is Space Design Architecture, as I mentioned earlier? So working in your former employer with Suters, where did SDA come into your plans?
I never really had plans to leave Suters. I was really happy at Suters, but then over time I kind of took a step back and looked at why I became an architect. I'd always wanted to do houses, and at Suters we were largely doing fairly large projects, and we didn't do many houses at all at Suters. So in the 12 years that I worked there, I'd never done a house. So I thought it was time that I really kind of ventured out and took that step and made sure that I was doing the things that I wanted to do, made sure that I kind of went with the right people, and that we all kind of, it started from a discussion with Daniel and myself, that we kind of had that thought that we'd like to work for ourselves and get into doing houses, and it all kind of went from there. So there was the bunch of us in the end kind of all took that step. We were working on our own but sharing resources, so sharing insurance, sharing ArchiCAD licenses, that kind of thing, just working on our own together, and then it's really just taken the steps from there. So we're very lucky that Leigh came on board with us, because otherwise the company wouldn't be running.
Now with SDA, there's yourself, Leigh, Richardson and Daniel Bush. So the three of you are the directors of SDA. I love the name Space Design Architecture. So what does SDA mean to you?
SDA to me, when we talk about space, we get a lot of people asking us about the name and wondering if it's space as in outer space. But we certainly quickly correct them that space is part of our name, because space is what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to achieve really high quality spaces for people to live, work and play in, and it's free. Essentially, the space that we're creating is free. The arrangement of those spaces is what makes them special. So our aim is to create we've got a couple of catchphrases that we use a bit. One is better space, not more space. So our aim is to create really efficient spaces that aren't wasted space. If there's a way to create space that's got more than one use, then we'll try and do that. We try and minimise circulation, minimise corridors, because every kind of bit of area that you build, you've got to pay for. So as efficient as we can make our buildings, the better that is for people, because they can then focus that money on areas where it's important. And that's the same whether it's residential or commercial or education, whatever that is. The more efficient you can make spaces, the better you can make the overall space.
Yeah, look, I love that idea and that concept because, and I have to declare, I have used your firm's services, and Dylan Try, who's a special mate of mine, he's an employee in your group. Because the problem is, most people that say come to you for your services, they already have a fairly good idea of what they want to do with their space. So if you can go in there with a fresh set of eyes, and I know that sounds obvious, but from what I've seen you guys can do is you can take someone's idea who they may be fixated on, right, this is what I want in this extension, or this is how I want my house to look. But you can actually challenge that idea and maximize better use of that space. And like you said, not necessarily more space, but better space.
Yeah, that's right. What we find a lot is that people come to us thinking they know what they want because they've lived in a space or they've worked in a space, and they kind of know what they don't like, and it's really easy to get fixated on a way to fix that when you're in that space all the time. The benefit that we have is we can take that step back and go, well, yes, you could do it that way, but you could also do it this way, and you could also do it this way. So our aim is to take what they bring to us as a brief, and then we'll dissect that and we'll pull it apart and we'll make sure that the relationships of the spaces are working, and that we then kind of put those spaces back together. And again, that's whether it's a residential project or a commercial project. We look at the relationship of the spaces, how they need to function, and we also look at the why behind what people are wanting. It's very easy to just take a plan that a client brings to us and just draw that up, but that's not really what we do. What we aim to do is improve on that or question that, and it may well end up being exactly what they come to us with. That might be what we end up doing, but we make sure that we question everything that we do, and that everyone in our office certainly questions everything that everyone else does. We're a pretty tight group and we're in a relatively small space, so it's pretty constant that everyone's walking past your desk and just looking at what you're doing on your screen and offering suggestion, sometimes ridicule, sometimes general humour, but most of the time it's constructive feedback that gives another perspective on what we're doing.
What do you like most about your job in terms of, say, a new client comes on board and calls up, makes an inquiry? What's your favourite aspect of that inquiry, and how do you take that from, I guess, concept to developing some sort of brief?
Probably the thing that I like most about it is how varied it is. So no project is the same. So we get we've got a lot of clients, we've got a lot of projects, which is great. But they are very varied in what they're after, very varied budgets, very varied sites. So I think that's the good thing for me, is that every project is different and every project has a different answer. So the process is fairly similar. We get a brief, we get a site, we analyse those things, we check the rules, and then we come up with a concept based on that. So that process doesn't change no matter what the project is, but the outcome is always different. That's the bit that I like, where we're not building volume, we're not building the same thing over and over. It's different every time.
I'd imagine it's a bit of a fight to get out there and see the job, like, because I obviously love building, construction and architecture, the whole lot. So if it was me and I was working here, I'd be sort of jumping over everyone saying, oh, I want to come to site, I want to have a look at this job, I want to meet these people. Like, what do you do that process? Do you, 3 of you go out, or 2 of you go have a look at the job, or do you invite the client in for a first up meeting? How does that work?
Yeah, generally speaking, we'll get the client in first. So we get them to come into the office where we can show them previous projects that we've done. We can talk to them about our process and make sure that they're kind of on board with that. But then pretty soon after that, we do go out to site and we try and get a good feel for what the site's like. Sometimes we'll go to site more than once. We'll go multiple times just to make sure that we're kind of across all the aspects of it. Everyone in the office kind of likes that part of it. You get to go out and experience kind of the way that other people are living. Sometimes it's varied from the way that you're living. So it's part of the job that everyone seems to really like, and it doesn't matter who it is. So yeah, it's really interesting going into other people's homes or other people's workplaces to see how they function and how you can help them improve that.
And I'd imagine it's a bit of an exercise of challenging as well. I mean, you mentioned workplace, so we've just seen the whole world be forced to adapt, and it's happened very quickly. So I guess it's about going to, say, a workplace and rethinking concepts. I mean, you can see on Instagram lately, like, I've seen a lot of architectural firms advertising workplaces and changing their workplace because people are now combining working from home and working in the office or sharing space. So space has become probably, more and more important than ever at the present. So it would be amazing working in your office because you have different people working on different projects, and I want to see what you're working on and I want to see what the other guy's working on, and so there'd be a really collaborative environment working.
Yeah, it is. It's constant collaboration. We spend a lot of time in the office, so we're together as much as we see our families a lot of the time. So having fun doing what we're doing is really important to us. Another one of our little phrases is we take our work seriously but not ourselves. So we're forever taking the piss out of each other. We're constantly, there's constant banter in the office about projects and comments on each other's projects, and those things all lead us to not defend our projects but really question what we're doing. So it's really good that you get that feedback and you get it in a jovial kind of way that you can take it on board, but not have to kind of be really serious and sit down for a formal review about a design. It's a pretty intuitive kind of process where everyone is reviewing everyone just by the fact that we're all in the same space.
The other challenge too, which I think would be a bit of a juggle, is architects are inherently artistic and they are very intellectual. To be an architect and run a practice, do you wear 2 different hats to be able to do that?
Yeah, it is a balance. That's why we're really lucky. Leigh is the organised one in the 3 of us.
And that's really funny, isn't it? Because I've met Leigh a couple of times and Leigh's probably the quietest one from what I've seen. Or is that just not behind the scenes?
Yeah, no, he is. But he's more calculated and more organised, more disciplined than Daniel and myself.
So Leigh's the methodical one.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. So, and it's weird. Daniel and I both do mostly residential work, and Leigh does most of our commercial interior stuff. So, it's just happened that way that our work is naturally kind of spread. That's how we work. So it does work really well. Having 3 very different personalities is really good because we kind of cover all bases. So
I guess in the example of working, say, a carpenter who wants to become a builder, all of a sudden he goes off the tools, becomes more office-based, therefore he misses out on his passion, which was why he got into the trade in the first place. So that seems to be a common trend. So I guess having 3 different heads, you're able to cover all bases, like you just said, and you can still work in your passionate role as an architect.
Yeah, that's right. We definitely, all 3 of us, still want to do architecture. We don't want to be managers for managers' sake or just business people. We got into this because we love architecture and we love solving people's problems and creating great buildings. So that's certainly important to all 3 of us. We've got a really good office manager who looks after all the important stuff that we don't really...
Picks up the slack.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. She looks after us, and I always make the joke that I don't know what she does, but I also don't know, I don't want to know what she does.
Because it's working.
Yeah, that's right. So if I need to know what she does, then that's a problem. So she'll hate me for saying that, but
that's a good compliment, and equally critical role in the practice as well. How does your practice work in terms of like structure?
So we're a fairly flat structure. So anyone at any point could be running a project. So we don't really have too much of a hierarchy. Leigh and Alison look after most of the business side. Daniel and I look after kind of reviewing all the documentation, either from a design perspective or a construction perspective, that goes out of the office. So we do have that review process in place. We'd like it to be more thorough than it is sometimes, but essentially after that we've got team leaders, and then we've got a whole range of architectural roles that go from, we've got a couple of work experience students at the moment, we've got a couple of 3rd-year grads, and then a couple of 5th-year grads as well as some guys who are still at uni. So there's a lot of balls in the air, a lot of part-time roles, but it just kind of works because we've got a varied workload as well. So we do a lot of varied projects. We've got some large projects on, a couple of projects up to the kind of $15-20 million mark, which is great, and then houses down to kind of the $150,000 mark. So
I think that's quite clever and strategic too, because when it's on, and you're able to, I guess, cover more bases, put people into those roles when you need to, and equally pull back the slack when in between those jobs.
Yeah, that's right. It's a very reactive industry. A lot of our timeframes are set by our clients. Dealing with council and other authorities also kind of puts a time pressure on things. It gives us a lot of kind of balancing that we need to do with our projects, and making sure that we've got work for everyone to do, but as well make sure that all our clients are getting their projects done on time and on budget. So yeah, it is a bit of a juggling act, but that is helped by the varied nature of the work that we've got.
How do you handle your, I guess, fee proposal, or how do you typically engage with a client? What sort of process is involved with that? If the job's $1 million, well, $100,000 fee.
Yep.
Does that still exist?
I think, yeah, some people do still use percentage-based fees. We'll use percentages sometimes to check kind of our fees, but the way that we approach our fees is we look at the amount of time we think it's going to take us, and then put our hourly rates against that. We're pretty open and transparent about our fees with our clients. Working with a lot of private residential clients, it's kind of hard to show that value sometimes until the end. So it is sometimes a bit of a hard sell, but we do get really good reflections on our service at the end of the project. So we get a lot of clients who refer us to friends. Most of our work is through referral, whether that's through builders or through clients themselves. So it's good to see that our clients do value what we do, and that's the difficult thing when people haven't used an architect before, to be able to instill that confidence in people that we're going to give them a good result in the end. So,
what would you say has been the biggest change you've seen over the years in terms of running an architecture practice?
Probably the biggest change that I've seen even in the 20 odd years that I've been working in architecture, is the level of documentation. And I think across the board in architecture, the level of documentation has almost gone down, but the level of documentation that's required has gone up. So there's a bit of a disparity there, in my view, with the way that building is done now. So it's harder and harder to get the really good tradesmen to just take your design intent and run with it. So there's a lot more documentation kind of needs to be done, but the quality of that documentation is it's difficult to achieve.
Now, what about costs? Like, in terms of, it's obviously a very difficult challenge with any construction project. If someone comes into your office, doesn't matter who it is, what architect, wherever, sometimes more often than not, costs come into it. How do you handle costs when the client says, "Oh, this is my budget," or you say, "How much money have you got to spend with your particular project?"
Very difficult question.
There's no way around it, is there?
No, that's right. And it's a very varied answer because every project is different. So very difficult to put a square metre rate against a project or go off previous projects because they are so varied. So
do you use that square metre rate as a bit of a check? Like, does that actually work?
Yeah, we do. So we give people a range when we kind of first meet with them to say, based on the brief that you've given us, we think the level of complexity is going to be, it's going to put your project at about this square metre rate. So we'll give them a range of what we think it's going to be. And that gives us a check where we can then check that against the brief that they've given us and put that into an area schedule. So we can say, you've briefed that you want an extra 150 square metres. That's going to be at X rate. So therefore your project budget is either on track or it's skewed from the start. So we have those checks and balances in place first up, but then after that, we try and engage with a builder or builders or a quantity surveyor early on in the process. So our overall aim is to get our projects built. It's not architecture until it's built. Until then, it's art.
True.
And
well
our clients don't want to pay us to do art. So
correct.
Our aim is to make sure that every building that we do gets built. That's really important to us. So we try and get builders involved as soon as we can. So from concept design, we try and get pricing then, and then we try and work with a builder from that point for the rest of the project so that we can keep on track. Gives the builder confidence that they're going to get the job, and it gives our clients confidence that the project can actually be realised for the price they want to spend.
I think that's probably one of the biggest changes that I've seen from the work that I do as well, where builders are becoming more involved in a project from the early days with the architect. So I guess the traditional model was maybe the architect goes out to tender, picks 3 builders, has a couple of guys on their list, or might try someone else. But that's definitely been a shift towards working with a builder and collaborating, just like you do in your practice, doing the same sort of application in terms of working with a builder as well.
Yeah, we find it's a much more beneficial relationship for everyone because we're not getting to the end of that documentation process, then getting 3 tenders and finding out that something's over budget or something could be done a better way, and then having to go back and rework things. We find it's a much better process to get everyone involved early on, and then we're all working together towards the same goal. Especially with the way that council approvals are and the like these days, they take a very long time. So we don't want to get to the end of a project and then have to go back and revisit that.
What's it like from your perspective? Say you've been working on a project for 12 months or 6 months, and then you go out to site and you see your work actually being built. What's that feeling like, seeing it actually come to fruition?
That's pretty amazing for us. We've been lucky enough to have a lot of projects in Newcastle, so we can actually get out and see them. I'm quite constantly driving around Newcastle and just looking at past projects as well. It's really rewarding to actually see what you've envisioned from the start starting to come out of the ground. It's also good to see clients' reactions to that. So getting the feedback from them that I didn't realise it was going to look like that, or that space is better than what we thought it was going to be. That's really rewarding to kind of get that feedback and then to be able to work with them to help them visualise what they're going to have at the end from, like, at all stages of the process. We use a 3D software that they can see it in 3D and walk around it on their phone, but being there is a different thing altogether.
If you could pick a space in someone's home that's underutilised, with your practical experience and based on your role, what do you think's the least utilised space in people's homes?
I think it's probably the airspace above the space. I've been trying for years to get people to do cargo nets above living areas or above bedrooms, and I couldn't get anyone to do it, so I've had to do it on my own house. And my daughters love it. Their bedrooms have got mezzanines for their desk, and then we've got a cargo net across the rest of their bedroom that they can just sit in and read a book or hang out, and they love it.
So you can actually sit in the cargo net, actually use it.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. So making multi-use spaces, I think, is the big thing for me. So I don't think there's one individual space that's underutilised, but I think there's a lot more opportunity in spaces to make them more fun and more usable at different times. So especially in houses, we've done a lot of houses recently, so trying to make them a bit more playful, trying to get a bit more fun in them. Finally got someone to let me put a slippery dip in their house, which is good. One of my mates, so he couldn't say no. But having spaces that are a bit more fun really floats my boat.
What about outside of Newcastle or even New South Wales? Where have you guys done some work outside of this area?
We've got a fair bit of work on the Central Coast at the moment. So a few projects in Gosford, a few projects in Wyong, a project in Tukley. So we've got a fair bit on down there. We've got some projects just finished in Maitland. And then we've got a really interesting house in Sydney, which is a 200 square metre block in Freshwater. And we're getting a passive house. Our first passive house is being built down there at the moment. So that's a really awesome project, a really constrained site. And the building envelope is basically the house footprint. So it's a really tricky one, but a really rewarding one.
So how many bedrooms on that 200 square metre site?
So it's a 3-bedroom house, single living area, doesn't have a garage, but the clients didn't really need a garage. It's got a carport. That's all they needed. But yeah, fitting a 120 square metre 3-bedroom house onto a postage stamp sized site, been tricky, but it's a really rewarding one. And I think it'll possibly be one of my favourite houses just due to all those constraints.
That's a hell of a challenge, 200 square metres. So I'd say you're just a firm for the job.
Yes. So we've done a few tight projects in Newcastle. But yeah, that one was one that's pretty special because it's a really tricky constrained site. We've also done a couple of projects now in Tasmania, which is good. We had to get registered down there, which is a fairly different process in Tassie because the weather is colder. So it's just a different set of constraints down there. So it's been an interesting learning curve doing 2 houses down in Tassie.
And are they along the lines of being passive as well, or say more eco-friendly homes?
We try and not kind of separate that from what we do day to day. We try and make everything certainly a true passive house, The one in freshwater is the only one that we've done. But what we try and do is make sure that every one of our designs is as environmentally friendly as we can. So we certainly look at all the principles in every project, making sure that we're getting the sun right, we're getting the breezes coming through the house as much as we can. We use a lot of courtyard spaces so that we can get a lot of windows and a lot more air circulating through the house. And then trying to make sure that we instill all of those principles in all of our projects.
I think that's important to note also, because that's where paying that premium, if you like, for an architect to have you guys come along, design a project or a renovation, even a small extension as part of your home, that's the difference, I guess, between going to someone like you guys, an architect, or utilising a draftsman.
Yeah, we aim to make sure that every project is really thoroughly thought through. So whether that's the use of space, whether that's the passive environmental aspects of a project, whether it's just the day-to-day how people are going to spend their time in that space, we try and make sure that we've really thoroughly thought it through and that we've questioned it all. And that we've questioned our clients and that our clients are on board with what we're doing. So we try and make sure we've got a fairly thorough process that we go through to make sure that we've asked the right questions and that we've fleshed out all the issues.
What's it like, I guess, it's a bit like the example of building your own home. If you're a builder, yes, you should build every home just like it's your own. But in reality, when it's your own home, you're looking at other details that you aren't as emotionally invested in on other jobs. So what's it like? I'd imagine that would be very similar with you going onto site and you've got this house or this renovation or this project in your mind. You've had it in concept for so long, and then you go to site and it's not being built how you'd imagine it to be. What do you sort of do in that situation?
That's always a difficult process. We try and balance that out by using the technology that we've got at hand. So we use a piece of software called a BIMX model. So we provide that BIMX model to builders now to enable them to see where materials come together and how the junctions work, and try and limit the question marks on what we design. You still get to site and see a lot of things that aren't how you've kind of envisaged them, but that's part of the art of what we do, I think, is working with the builder throughout the whole process to make sure that we're getting those details right. So our aim is to be involved in a project from start to finish. We like to work with the builder on site to make sure that we have those discussions early on, that we cover all those kind of bases from the start of the project so that we're limiting the amount of issues that we're going to have down the track.
Now, BIMX, for those that are listening to this and don't know what BIMX is, it's basically it's in the form of an app where you guys upload your model in, and it spits it out into, say, 3D, and you can use it on your phone or iPad. You can look at all sorts of details on site.
Yeah, it's been a really useful tool for us, especially doing the one-off residential houses where people aren't used to looking at plans, and for some people it's harder to translate 2D plans into the third dimension. So having that tool just enables our clients to visualise their house much earlier than they could otherwise. Also makes them question a lot more things.
True. And I've used it too, and you can put your phone on the back of some 3D goggles and basically walk around as if you're actually walking around inside your home. Yeah,
it's can be a really off-putting feeling. It's a little bit daunting, but yeah, as long as you're sitting down and you're looking around, it's a really good process to just be able to really visualise what you're going to get and the feeling of the space that you're going to get.
Yeah, I think it irons out those creases as well, where you can actually get that extra level of input and insight into how that space is actually going to look and feel and integrate when you're actually living in that space.
Yeah, and it's really changed our design process in a way, because our clients are a lot more invested early on in those details. So rather than a lot of those decisions being made during the construction process, most of that is happening now during the design process, which hopefully kind of leads to a better outcome and a more guaranteed outcome in terms of cost. So hopefully it's making less variables during that construction process.
What's it like looking back now, James, where you were having those early meetings and thinking about starting your own practice, and you then went out and started SDA, and now you've got a team of nearly 20 employees. So what's it like looking back now on those early days?
It's really fulfilling, I think is the word, because we did start out with a bunch of us kind of working for ourselves together. Some of us had real jobs while we got enough money to pay our mortgages. So coming from there in the 8 years that we've been running, and it really kind of snowballed. So it's been good. We've gained a lot of momentum. We've got a lot of really good projects around town that we're really proud of, and we've got a lot of really good people here. That's something that we've worked really hard on over the 8 years, making sure that we've got the right people.
It's a hard thing to do, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
And particularly with 18 or getting onto 20 employees, it's quite a difficult process.
Yeah, and it's I mean, we're a creative industry, so we want to make sure that we're getting that creative side in all our employees, but also people who understand buildings and know how things go together. It's important for us that every one of our projects gets built and is buildable from the outset. So just making sure that everyone here has got that understanding or that thirst to understand about buildings and how they go together and how they work and how the details work and how the materials come together and what materials to use. It's really important that everyone that we have is passionate about that.
I think that's one of the most important things that we've talked about in this podcast, and that is having that practical experience. So if you're an architect, it's so important to have that experience. And I guess for those that are listening to this and they may be an architect, how do you get that practical experience? I mean, if you're like the young James who's just finished his 3 years of university and is just starting out and looking forward to a career, what's the best advice you could give those people that are perhaps finding that they're lacking that practical experience with building as an architect?
My advice is probably twofold. One is build something, actually put stuff together with your hands.
Like at home, whether it's a deck or a feature in your garden or something.
Yeah, yep. Could be anything. Build some furniture, build yourself a bed. Just put what you've done in theory into practice. So that's certainly one important thing. The other thing is go to building sites. Go and talk to people. Go and talk to foremen. Go and talk to the carpenter who's putting the frame up and ask them what the problems are. That's kind of the best way to get that practical experience, because people will tell you what's wrong and you pretty quickly get an understanding of what not to do by just going and seeing what gets done and what needs to be fixed on building sites. There's a lot of wastefulness in buildings, the way that things are designed not to standard dimensions and not to sheet sizes of cladding materials. So there's a lot of wastage. So the more practical experience and the more site experience you get, the better you'll understand that and the better you'll be able to design based on practical knowledge of how things work. Just makes you a better architect.
What you just said reminded me of my younger self when I remember working for a property developer, and and we were also building and developing the site, and I was working on site, and I remember working as a contract administrator, and then I became assistant project manager, and I was doing a bit of everything, bit of estimating as you do working on jobs like that. And I remember I was lacking some practical experience, and so I asked my boss, I said, look, can I bring some work boots and some shorts, and then on a Friday when things are a bit quieter, and can I start a bit earlier? Can I get out? And because we had a great team of chippies, and one of them was a foreman, and he was so encouraging of me asking him questions. And I think you're exactly right. And just making that little bit of extra effort of thinking outside the box to try and get that bit of extra practical experience.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And it's not easy to get sometimes, that experience. That's why I think it's important to just build things yourself, or push your employer to let you come to site, or get a job as a labourer. Any of those kind of things, they're all going to give you better experience than you're going to get just looking in CAD.
Now, James, if people listening to this want to get into contact with you, or even better, have you involved in their architectural project, what's the best way to go about it?
Just touch base with us on our website or Instagram, or feel free to just come into the office. We're here all the time, so feel free to call in and have a chat.
I really appreciate you giving up your time coming on to Build Hatch. I've truly enjoyed sitting here listening to you talk and picking your brain and having a chat from an architect's perspective. Thank you for coming on to Build Hatch.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode of Build Hatch. You got to hear about James' views on working with a really great bunch of positive people who are just like his family. What a really nice guy, and I encourage you to check out some of their work, especially if you're thinking about an upcoming project. Well, as usual, there's plenty going on in the world at the moment. Please do keep the positive stories coming through, and if you'd like to be a guest on our show, please reach out or feel free to join our community by following us on Instagram. Have a great week, and you'll hear me on the airwaves again next week. Thanks for listening to another episode of Build Hatch.
You have experienced a Build Hatch developed production.